In this video, we're going to go through creating the Simon Says memory game from scratch. This is a full tutorial from start to finish, so we're going to go through every single line of code, every formatting step, and every troubleshooting step together. Without further ado, let's jump in. Alright, let's start by designing the layout we're going to use to play the game. So Simon Says has 4 different squares that contain 4 different colors. They light up in some random sequence, and the user needs to follow that random sequence. And every time the user gets the sequence correct, the game essentially adds an additional color that flashes that the user needs to remember for them to be able to continue on in the game. So let's start by building those 4 squares out. And to do so, we can just kind of adjust the column widths that we have here. So maybe 250 for column C, 250 for column E, just something that's make those 2 columns symmetrical. And then we could do the same if we look at row 5. We can do the same thing down here, 250. And then we'll do the same thing for row 3, 250. And this should give us 4 symmetrical squares. So here we have our 4 squares, and those look like those are looking pretty good. What we'll also do is since we don't want this big column in the middle here, we'll drop column D down to 5 pixels just to make some separation between these 2 squares. And we'll also do the same thing in row 4. We'll drop this down to 5 pixels as well. So there we have it. Now we have our 4 squares, which look pretty good. And because we want this to be in the middle of the screen, let's also just make column A around 400 pixels. Just to push everything over to the right hand side. So there we go. Now everything looks more into the middle of the screen. Let's also just go ahead and make column 1 much bigger, just so we can put a title up here as well. We'll also want to frame this game with our playing board. So let's just drop column B down to 25 pixels, and let's drop column F down to 25 pixels as well. And just like that. So now what we can do is just select all these cells here. We'll select these cells. I'm selecting all these multiple cells just by holding down the control button on my keyboard. And we'll just set this to some kind of dark gray like that. So now it's framed in our board. I'll also do the same thing here. So I'll just hold the shift key and hit the down arrow. And the same thing here. I'll continue holding control and then the shift key here. So there we go. Just allows me to select everything there. And there we go. Now we have our 4 cells that are now partitioned by a nice little dark gray frame. Now we'll also want to put in our colors into these cells. So let's go ahead and do that. On top left, we can put this to green. On the top right, we'll put this to orange. Bottom left, we will set this to yellow, and then the bottom right, we'll set this to blue. So just like that, we have our base playing board looking pretty good. Next, let's go ahead and enter in a few shapes. In this case, you technically could just merge the cells if you'd like to. For my purposes, I like including shapes. I think they look a little better. So I'm just going to go ahead and add in a shape. I'm going to use the rectangular rounded corner shape. I typically like the way this one looks, and we'll just kind of drop it over top like that. I'm going to make the title black, and I'm also going to change it to white font, and I'm going to change it to stencil for the font. I like the way stencil looks, and let's just call this Simon Says the game, something like that. I'll center the font. I'll make the font a little bigger so that it stands out. What I'm also going to do, since I need 2 more shapes, I'm going to need a shape for the user to start a new game, and I'm going to use a second button down here for the user to submit their guess once they've actually clicked all the cells to be able to, proceed with the game on to the next round. So I'm just going to copy this shape, and I'm just going to make 2 copies of it. First one, again, as I said, is going to be new game. So I'm just going to type new game. The second one is going to be submit guess. Just like that. I'm also going to change the way these look. So I'm just going to format this to maybe be like a nice gray, something like that. We'll also change the font in here to be black. something like that. And also because now black doesn't really show very well if you're going to use a bevel. But what I'm going to do, since this is a gray button, you can actually go into Format, Shape Effects, Bevel, and you can make it look more like a button. Now it gives it some shading, some rounding on the sides, so it looks a little more like a button. Same with this one. I'm going to make this more of like a dark gray, something like that. And I'm also going to do the same thing where you have the bevel, just like that. These buttons don't need to be that big, so I'm just going to select both of them and kind of drop them down maybe to something like that. And that's looking pretty good. The next thing I want to do is essentially merge some cells together so that I can use this box as a high score counter, or at least the high score indicator. So I'm going to put this to high score, and I'm going to use this as the text box to just show this is where the high score is, and then this to have it actually populate a value for their high score. So I'm going to select both of these cells. Again, I'm going to use stencil just because I like that font. Make it a little bigger. Maybe let's just do 16. And in this case, I'm going to do right align. And in this case, I will do center align. So right now this is going to be blank, but this is a value that's going to be populated by the macro once we actually start running the game through VBA code. I'm going to do the same thing down here. I'm going to select all these cells, and I'm going to use, again, the merge and center. Make sure it's bottom aligned centered. That's great. I'm going to again change this to stencil, and I'm going to make the font around size maybe 18. So in this case, we're going to use this as more of a indicator to the user. So it's going to basically tell them, hey, it's your turn, or watch as the pattern's being generated, something like that. And if the game's over, it'll prompt them to say game over. If they got a new score, it'll say new high score. But for now, we'll leave it blank because, again, we'll have this cell populated with VBA code. Ideally, we'll want these buttons to kind of just overlay those cells and kind of make everything look centered. So maybe we can just do something like that. And that looks okay. And I think overall, in terms of formatting, we're pretty much there. The last thing I like to do is just remove the grid lines. It makes things look a little more clean. And with that being the case, I think we're there. So at this point, we'll move on to the next step, and we'll leave the formatting as is. Now that we have the layout ready, we want to be able to actually do something with it. So typically when you're playing Simon Says, every time you click on one of these, or you'd hit this with your finger, you'd see the color change. So if I hit the blue, you'd see a darker blue. You hit the orange, a darker orange. Same for the green and same for the yellow. So the best way we can replicate that in Excel is every time I click on one of these colors, we just want it to change into a darker shade of itself. Now, the easiest way to replicate this is through a worksheet event in VBA, and it's a selection change event, which means every time I change whatever cell is selected on this worksheet, it's going to call that macro to run and execute whatever code is inside of it. So in this case, we can get to that pretty easily. We can go to view code on the tab, and it'll just bring us into our Visual Basic Editor. And you'll see that the sheet 1, code window is selected. Right here, it's general declarations. So we're going to want to go into worksheet. And by default, this is actually what we get, which is a worksheet selection change event. And that's great. This is exactly what we're looking for. So we don't need to, pick from our drop-down menu. We already have the type of sub-procedure we're looking for. So in this case, since we're looking to change the color of specific cells when they're clicked, we're going to use the if not intersect function. So that looks something like this, intersect, and it's going to ask us for different arguments. In this case, we're going to want to use target, which is the cell we click, and we're going to want to evaluate it. In this case, let's just say range C3, and we're going to say is nothing. Then end if. So in this case, essentially what we're saying is if the cell that we've selected is within this range, C3, and we want C3 because that is this cell right here, so we're going to focus on the green cell first. So if the cell I've clicked is C3, and that's target being C3, then execute this bunch of code. That's what this function is telling us is going to happen. And that's essentially what we need to be able to change the colors every time we click on one of those cells. So really all we need to do here is just change the interior color, and we can do that, the interior color of those specific cells to something else. So we can do that through the interior color function. And in this case, I'm going to use an RGB code. And I've already pulled these numbers out ahead of time. So just to make this a little quicker, comma 51. So really what this is saying, every time I click on a cell, if that target cell is C3, go ahead and change the color to this. So let's try it out right now. I can click over here. You see nothing's happening. As soon as I click on this cell, you see it turns to a dark green. That's great. That's exactly what we want. Now, if everything, no matter what I do, it's still dark green. So we obviously need to account to change it back to its original color when I click one of these cells. So we'll focus on that next. I know I had included this RGB code because I already had it ready off screen. If you're looking to understand what that is or how you'd find that, you would just go into your Home tab. You'd go into your Fill Color, More Colors, and you'd be able to just pull your RGB code right from here. So that's how you find that. So let's go back into here. At this point, I've changed. So basically when cell C3 is clicked, we know we want it to turn dark green, but we want to make sure we reset the other 3 cells. So I already have code again off screen. I'm just going to pull in and copy and paste just so it is it's much quicker. And really all this is doing, again, now it's saying E3 will change back to its original color, C5 will change back to its original color, and E5 will change back to its original color. And that's great. So again, you won't see any change right now, but this is going to essentially return everything back to its original color. I can do this very similar for the other bunch of cells. So we need to do this 4 times. I'll just bring in the code to show you what that looks like. So there's the same code instead of for C3, now it's for E3. We can show you what that looks like. If we go here, if I click on E3, you'll see now it turns, and this goes back to its original color, and I can do that as well. Again, you still see nothing for these because I haven't added in the code, but that's all we're doing is we're basically just changing its color as soon as we click on it. So we'll go back into our VBA code window. We'll grab the code over here for now C5, and we'll end if. And we'll grab the code for our last cell, which looks like this right here. End if. So now we have code for each of those 4 cells that'll change the color every time it's being clicked. And this is great. This is all we need to worry about in terms of our worksheet change event for now, to make sure that we have these cells changing whenever they're clicked. This way, so when the game runs, it's going to show us a pattern, and we're basically going to have to follow that pattern by clicking on these cells. So that'll end this section, and we'll move on to the next. Okay, so this is great. We have this working such that no matter what cell we click on, we see that it changes to the color, the darker color of itself, and we can move on just like that. The only problem is, unless we click something else, it's going to stay that color. We need to add in the ability for this to go back to its original color so that we can see, this is being selected and then it goes back to its original color, then this is being selected. The main reason is if the game happens to select orange twice in a row, it's basically that let's just say it wants us to select orange twice in a row. If it just stays in this solid color, we won't know that it's telling us that. So we need to add in a way for it to go back to its original color. Now we can do that through using VBA code, and essentially what we'll do is just add in a new module, and we'll use a function. Let's just call it function waste time. And I'm calling it that just because essentially what we're going to do is just tell Excel to wait for a certain amount of time, and then after that certain amount of time, set all the cells back to their original light colors. So we're just going to waste some time. And now we can do this in a few ways. The first way is through application.wait. I personally don't like this method because it's not super accurate. Sometimes it'll give you, let's say if you want to wait for 1 second, sometimes it's only half a second, sometimes it's more than 1.5 seconds. It's all over the place. It's fairly accurate, but when you're talking about specific seconds, it's not very accurate. There is another way that I much prefer, And it uses something called get tick count. And now get tick count is something that actually comes from your Windows API library. So I'm going to declare it as a public function. And this is, again, we don't need to worry too much about this, but this term right here, get tick count, is actually what we'll be using to determine how long we're waiting. And it's very accurate because this measures the amount of time from when your operating system was last restarted. So in this case, we'll know that this is constantly changing millisecond over millisecond from when your operating system was last restarted. So if we add a certain amount of time onto this, we'll know very accurately what 1 second looks like in Excel, which is exactly what we want. So we can just use something called, ntick. This is just a random variable, is get tick count plus, and we're going to use a variable that we pass into this function. Let's just call it finish times 1000. And we're multiplying it by 1000 because, again, this is in milliseconds. So anything that we pass into this function, and since we're passing it into this function, we need to say finish as double. Anything we pass into this function, it's going to basically say, multiply by 1000 milliseconds, or in other words, 1 second. So if we pass 2 into this function, it's going to wait for 2 seconds. If we pass the number 1, it's going to wait for 1 second, so on and so forth. And while this is happening, we want to do and loop until. I should have actually written this first, but do, we'll say now tick instead of end tick. Now tick is your get tick count. As I mentioned, this get tick count will constantly change as time passes, because again, it's counting the amount of time since your operating system was last restarted. So this get tick count will constantly change, which means your now tick will constantly change. And while that's happening, we're just going to say do events. And do events basically is just a way to tell Excel, hey, just keep going the way you were. Don't worry about anything else. Just keep going, and don't think about anything else. That's really it. And then when we loop until, we're going to loop until now tick is greater than or equal to end tick. And all this is doing is basically saying when this function is called, it's going to run this code as many times as it has to until the now tick is greater than the end tick. So the now tick is constantly changing. The end tick we know is defined from the beginning because it's a certain time from when your operating system was restarted plus some arbitrary time that we're adding onto it. So when this loop starts, this now tick is definitely going to be less than your end tick, but over time, as your get tick count increases, it'll eventually be larger or equal to, but eventually larger than your end tick. And that's when the function will end. So during this time, while this loop is consistently running, that's the time that we're wasting. And that's why I've called it waste time. So this function's great, but on its own, it doesn't do anything. So let's go back into our worksheet change event. Now here, let's just go ahead and put in, waste time. So we're going to use that function, and we'll just wait for 1 second. And we'll do that for each of these cells. And we'll just waste 1 second every time. So every time the cell is clicked, it's going to waste 1 second after we click that cell. Or after, I should say, after that cell is selected. Now, the last thing we need to do is we need to basically find a way to reset. So once we've done that, now we've told Excel to wait a second. So while I've done this, after I've clicked here, it's waiting a second. But nothing really else is happening. So we need to find a way to reset these cells back to normal. And to do that, we can use something like this. We can use cell D4 since it's so small and we're not using it for anything else. Let's just use another worksheet change event for D4. Like this. Put this to D4. And let's go ahead and make sure C3 goes back to its original color, which we can use this right here. Oh, maybe that's not the right one. I copied it from here. Let's make sure, E5 goes back to its original color. And then let's basically say, since this is going to be our reset cell, whenever D4 is clicked, it's going to reset all the colors. let's make sure that we select cells 4, 4. So you can use the range function. So cells 4, 4 is the same as writing range D4. In this case, I've just written cells 4, 4. And we'll just do something like this since we want this to happen each and every time. So now when we go back in, we can go ahead and click. It waits a second and you see it goes back to the middle now. So after we click, it goes to the middle. You can see it gets selected there and it resets our colors back to normal. So this is awesome. Now if we end up having a sequence of cells being selected, it'll select one, go back to the middle, select another one, go back to the middle, select another one, and we'll have a way to constantly reset our playing field. So this is great, and we'll move on to the next section. So this is great. Now we have the functionality where we can click any number of cells in this section here, but after 1 second, it will always go back to the center. So this is very handy when it comes to building out a sequence, and we'll end up doing that when we start looking at building out the code for the game. So, let's shift focus into actually doing that, and let's start programming the initial macro we'll use to run a new game. So let's go back into our VBA code window, and we'll go back into our module 1, and we'll just create a new function here, or a new sub procedure, and we'll call it sub new game, just like that. So we have our new game sub procedure, and I think the first thing we'll want to do is, let's welcome the user. So let's go ahead and just say cells 5, 8 dot value is equal to welcome, just like that. So 5, 8, so that's row 5, column 8, which we have is right here. So row 5, column 8, it's going to say welcome, and we can test that out by right-clicking, assigning a macro to this button, and then putting in new game. So when we click that button, you'll see it says welcome. So this is just an easy way to say welcome, the game is starting, something like that. Again, if you decide to make this on your own, feel free to write in whatever you'd like. You can change around the messaging however you please. So that's great. We say welcome, and then the next thing I'd want to do personally is I'd want to show some kind of sequence on our screen here to indicate that the game is starting. So it's great to say welcome, but that doesn't really jump out at the user. I'd like it if we could find a way to, maybe light up these cells in a way that kind of indicate that the game is starting. So, let's do that. Let's go ahead and, create I'll reference to something and we'll call it start colors. But that's going to end up being a new sub procedure, and we'll call that sub start colors, just like that. So when this line of code gets called, it's actually going to call this sub procedure. And, technically you could code what I'm about to within this procedure, but doing it in a separate procedure just makes it look a little cleaner. So we'll do that. And overall, it just helps make your code look a little more organized. So in this case, really what we're going to want to do is basically just tell Excel to select each of these cells in some sequence. So in this case, let's just say we wanted to select this cell, then this cell, then this cell, then this cell, and we'll do that twice, just to give it some kind of, give it a nice spin to start the game. So we can do cells 3, 3 dot select, and then we could do cells 5, 3 dot select, and then cells 3, 5, or I guess it would be 5, 5 dot select, and then cells 3, 5 dot select. And we can do this twice. So we'll do that twice. We'll just copy that code out. We'll do it twice, and we'll see what that looks like. So when we hit new game, it says welcome, and then you see it goes ahead and just moves over to here. Now, this is pretty slow. This isn't ideal. We don't want this to be so slow. So instead, we're going to try and find a way to speed this up. And we can do that by just modifying our waste time function. So we do want this waste time function to show as 1 second every time. That is our ideal timing. But what we can do instead is just modify that timing. And we can do that by throwing in a variable that basically tells this waste time function if we want it to be a 1 second delay, if we want it to be less than a 1 second delay. So really all we're going to do is just add in an if statement that's going to basically say if cells, and we're going to use a cell way off the side of the screen. So let's just use something like cells 5, which would be, this is column Z in row 5. Dot value is equal to yes. Then execute this set of code. So in this case, I'll just set it like that. And I'll say else if cells 5, 26 dot value is equal to no, then end if. And we're going to use a separate set of criteria here. So we're going to copy this code and we'll paste it in here. But instead of it being by 1,000, let's just do it by 100. So right now this is taking every second and multiplying it by 1,000 milliseconds, which would give us 1 full second or 1,000 milliseconds. In this case, it's taking the value 1 and be multiplying it by 100 milliseconds. So this would only be 1/10 of a second, which would really speed things up. And what we can do here now is just go ahead, when the start colors sequence begins, let's set cells 5, 26 dot value equal to no. And then when it's done, let's go ahead and set it back to yes. Because we know generally we want, when a cell is selected, we want this code to run. We want a second delay every time. But we know when we run this start colors sequence, we want it to run very quickly. So in that case, we want it to run this section of code. So we're basically saying turn this to no so that it knows to run this section of code. And we can go back over and try this out. So when I click new game, you'll see it bounces around pretty quickly now. So if we scroll over to the right hand side here, you'll see it's now set to yes. And if I click the new game, it's kind of hard to see in the meantime, but you see right there it is set to no in the bottom right hand side. And when we go back over, it's back to yes. So that's all we're doing. We're just setting it to no to give us the ability to speed this up really quickly, which is great. It really does set us up so that we can enter a nice new game sequence. And towards the end of the game, when it's game over, we can do something similar, but we'll look at that when we get to that point in the code. So let's go back into our code here. That seems to work really well. So we've run our starting sequence, so the user is welcomed to the game. What we can do next is we can look at including another prompt to the user. So instead of welcome, now we can maybe prompt them to look at the board. So instead, let's just do maybe welcome. Now we could do watch closely, something like that. But we just want to make sure they have enough time because they might be awed by the opening sequence. Let's just go ahead and waste some more time, and we'll just throw in 2 seconds. And we'll do the same thing afterwards. Again, this is just giving the user enough time to make sure they have enough focus and they're looking at the screen accordingly. So when we go back over now, we can hit the new game. You'll see it'll dance around. It'll wait 2 seconds, and then we'll see watch closely. It'll wait 2 seconds. And at this point, we actually want the game to start. So we're not gonna cover the starting code, the game starting code in this section, but we'll move on to that right now. Okay, so at this point, when we click the new game button, we get this little dance. It says welcome, and then it waits a few seconds, and then it says watch closely. And at this point, this is when we'd expect the game to start. So we need to generate some code that will randomly select one of these 4 cells to light up so that we know which cell we need to click to submit our guess. So we can do that through using a random function, or a rand between function, which is a worksheet function. But before we do that, let's just go ahead and create, again, a new sub procedure, and we'll call it new square. How about that? So with this sub procedure, we're going to be generating a new square. And we can just do sub new square, something like that. And let's just create a new function, or a new variable. Generate square, something like that. And we can use the worksheet function, rand between. Now this is a great function for this because we can basically say pick a number between 1 and 4, and we'll use that number to determine which cell we want to select. So we can just use an if statement. If generate square is equal to 1, then do some certain amount of code. Else if generate square is equal to 2, then do some other code. And then we'll just copy this over for 3 and for 4. 4 and end if. So we'll change this to 3 and we'll change this to 4. So now we're saying this number is going to be generated through this RAM between. It's going to be a 1, 2, 3, or a 4. And then we're going to basically say if it's a 1, do this set of code. If it's a 2, do this. If it's a 3 or a 4, do this. And all we're going to do is just use, well, I should say we need to find a way to store this value. So it's all well and fine to basically just generate a square, and that's the square that lights up. But we need to do some further forward thinking and understand that every square we generate, we need to basically add it on to the existing list of squares that have already been generated. So if it's the first square, that's fine. But let's say we already have 10 squares that have been generated. We need to know the history of all those squares. So again, in this case, we can use some arbitrary cell way off to the side, and we can just use cells 1, 26. Again, this is in column 26, row 1. And then let's just add, or let's just set it the value equal to itself, because we basically want to add on to it as we generate more new cells. So to begin with, it'll be blank, but we're going to add whatever new cell was generated. So let's just do and 1, itself. So in this case, if it's the first time we're running the game and it generates a 1, the cell will be blank, but it's going to equal itself and then and 1, 1 and a comma. This might not make a ton of sense right now, but maybe once I copy and paste this code on for the other numbers, I'll show you and give you an idea of what that looks like. So in this case, let's assume the first time we run this function or this sub procedure, it's going to generate a random number. All these cells, like this cell will be blank, so 1, 26 will be blank. And if it's a 1, it's going to add a 1 onto it. It's just going to become a 1, nothing. Let's say this function's run again, and now this time it generates a 4. So this 1, nothing will already be in existence, so the cell value will already be 1, nothing. But then it's going to equal 1, nothing and a 4, nothing. So it's going to continually add on to itself every number that's generated. And by using a number that's generated, we're going to use that to light up the cells. So we can arbitrarily assign a 1 to, let's just say we use 1 as this, we use a 2 as this, 3 as this, and 4 as that. Something like that. But by clicking this new game, it's going to do its opening sequence. And now when we go over, you'll see cells here. It's generated a 4. So we haven't told Excel to actually light up anything here yet, but at least it knows now that it needs to light up whatever we arbitrarily assign 4 to. So if the cell we assign 4 to is this, we'll see this light up. But we will do that in the next section, and that's running through the sequence. All right, so now that we have a way to build a history of all the cells that show up in the pattern in the organized order, so random numbers showing up in a pattern, and we have a way to store those numbers, which is in cell Z1 or 1, 26, we need to find a way to run through all those numbers in sequence. So presently, we're generating a number with a comma, and then we need to find a way to tell Excel to actually light that cell up. And when there's 5 numbers in here, we need to find a way to actually run through each of those and have all 5 of those cells light up in sequence. So let's go ahead back into our code window and let's create a new sub-procedure called run sequence. So we'll do that right here, and we'll just call it sub run sequence. And similar to the new square function, we're going to end up using a similar logic we have down here. But first, we need to understand how many cells are referenced within cell 1, 26, or Z1. So when I say that, I mean it's a dynamic cell. Over time, as the game progresses, there's going to be more and more numbers within it. Initially, we'll have a 1, a 2, 3, 4, one of those options. But as the game progresses, we'll have several numbers in here. So we'll have a 1, something, 1, it could be 1, 3, 5, 4, 2, there could be 10 numbers. So we need to find a way to go through each of those numbers individually. To do so, we can use something or a function called split, in which case we know the cell that we want to split is cells 1, 26. And we know the delimiter, being the value that we want to be able to split the values on, is a comma. So super easy and super helpful function in this case is this is going to allow us to split the entire contents of that cell by a comma. So by every time there's a comma, it's going to split that cell up. And we're going to be able to see just the numbers that are within that cell. And it'll be able to give us the sequence we need to go through and light them up. So in this case, again, we'll want to use an if statement, and we'll say, actually, in this case, we don't want to use an if statement yet. We want to be able to loop through all of those cells, or all of those numbers within the cell. So we'll use a for statement for the lower bound of split string, which we know is always going to be 1, because there's always going to be a number in there. So the lower bound is telling us the size of the string. We know the lower bound is always going to be 1, regardless of whatever that first number is. The lower bound is 1, and we know we want to go to the upper bound of split string. So in this case, this could be 1, this could be 2, this could be 5. It all depends how many rounds we've gone through and how many numbers we've generated. So if it's the first round, this will be 1. If it's the 5th round, we know it'll be 5. If it's the 10th round, it'll be 10. And this is just going to allow us to loop through our sequence numbers as many times as we require. So now we'll use our if statements, and we'll say if split string I, so I being the value we're looping at. So if the first, in this case, if it's number 1, if it's the first value of split string is equal to 1, then let's just go ahead and say cells 3, 3.select. So what this is saying is if that first value is a 1, we're going to go ahead and select this cell. And that's really what we want. We want to be able to tell Excel different ways to select these 4 different cells. We can do something similar if we say else if, and if it's equal to 2, we can then set it to 3, 5. And let's just copy this code for the other 2 cells, and we'll do an end if. So now we'll set this one maybe to 5, 3, and we'll set this to 5, 5. And be sure to change these to 3 and 4. And just like that, we're able to loop through and select all the different cells in sequence. So when we go back to our function here and we click New Game, it'll run through our sequence, say welcome, it'll say watch closely, and there you go. Now it's lighting up that first cell, just like that. So now it's lighting up, I guess we have a 4 and a 2. If we were to run it again, it'll add a different number onto the end, and we'll see it go through. So it should be 4, a 2, and then it should give us one other one as well. So there we go. We see it's just adding on constantly to whatever we have in that cell. So this is how we're going to run through whatever sequence that we have in the cell. The next thing we'll need to do, obviously, is find a way to actually put in our own guesses and then track our guesses as well. And we'll cover that in the next section. Now we need to focus more on the user side. So far we've been able to automate the computer being able to select random colors and then lighting them up. But now we should focus on what happens when the user actually does their own inputs and how we can track that and have the computer log whether it's correct or not. So I think the first thing we also need to do before we jump into that is make sure that we erase this every time we run the new game. Because presently every time we click new game, it's just adding values onto the end of this, where we want this to be a fresh value every time. So we can hop back into our code window, and when we go to run the game, after we run the start colors sequence, maybe let's just set that value, so 1, 26, let's just set it to blank. So all we're doing there is just making sure that every time we run a new game, we're setting it back to 0. And again, you're only going to have to click this new game button once to start the game, and then the game will constantly run after that. So we'll just make sure to set that to 0 once we've run the game for the first time. So now, since we need to be able to track what the user does, let's go ahead and use an additional arbitrary cell. Since we're already using stuff in column 26, let's go back to our worksheet change event, and every time one of these cells is selected, let's just go ahead and maybe use cells 2, 26 dot value, is equal to itself, 2 comma 26 dot value, and let's say 1 comma, that's it. So similar to how we logged it when the computer made their choices, we're going to do the same thing, except now it's for the human. And we'll use similar code for each of these, except obviously we'll change this to a 2, we'll change this to a 3, and we'll change this to a 4. So now again, similar to how we were logging it for the computer, now this is being logged for the humans, and this is when we go to click it too. We can go back into our worksheet, our worksheet module, or just our module for the workbook, and we can make sure that we clear out that cell every single time it's the user's turn. So the reason we're doing this is because when the sequence runs initially, this is going to be the computer. So up until here, this is all the computer. The computer is doing things, and it's going to select the cell. And when it selects that cell, so when it runs the sequence and selects the cell, I should actually be highlighting this one, sorry. When it actually selects the cell, it's going to call this worksheet change event, which means it's going to put a value in there. But we don't want that because that's a computer selected event. And I can show you what that means actually. Maybe to show you what that looks like, let's just comment that code out and we'll go back into here. So right now we see this cell is blank. Sorry, right here. Z2 is blank. If we run the game now, you'll see this does its dance. It'll say welcome. And now we should see it only select one cell. So it's selected number 4. But if we go over here, you'll see it's given some kind of value in here, which we don't want. We don't want to see that. We want this to be blank because we want the user's values to be input in there only. We don't want computer values to be put in there. So any value in here outside of blank is pretty much unacceptable. So to be able to do that, let's just go ahead and again clear out whatever value goes in there. And this works much better. So when we know we've cleared it out, that's great because this gives it a blank slate for the user to enter the values that they want to enter. And we know this is going to be the case every time because every time, even if there were 10 numbers that the sequence runs through, we always want it to be a blank slate because the user needs to start from scratch every round. And then at this point, we can just say, we know it's now the user's turn. So let's go ahead and say cell 5, 8.value is equal to your turn, something like that. And again, this is just the same cell that we're using to do the welcome and watch closely. So that's really all we need to cover in this section is just making sure that we are showing or giving the user the ability to log their value on the first sequence. So to this point, we've basically created the game such that all of the computer movements are taken care of, and we've set it up so that it is now the first turn for the human. So when we go back into the game, we can see that over onto the side here, we can see that when you click new game, it goes through your opening sequence, it says welcome, and then it says watch closely, gives them a few seconds, and then it selects the cell. So at this point, it's saying your turn, and the user now must make a selection. So when we go over to the right-hand side, we see it selected cell 1, and if I were to click cell 1, we should see 1 as well. Instead, we're seeing false. So let's go back into our worksheet change event, and we'll see what's going on here. Cells 2, that's why. This should be an ampersand. So let's just go ahead and make that change to all of those, and make sure that this works as expected. So let's go back into our game now. Let's start a new game again, and it'll show us the welcome message. Watch closely. It'll select what we should expect to be 2. If we look over into the side, we'll see a 2. And now if I click 2 and go back over, we see a 2 shows up. So that's great. That's what we want to see. No issues there based on how that works. But now at this point, the user should be able to select submit guess. And if the user is correct, the game should continue, and the computer will now select this cell plus a new random cell. And if I'm wrong, if the user's wrong, it'll give some kind of, oh, better luck next time, something like that. So let's go in and create that sub-procedure we're going to use to submit the guess. So let's go back into our module, and then we'll just create a new sub-procedure, sub submit guess. And in this case, we'll just need to use an if statement. So we're going to say if cells 2, 26 value is equal to cells 1, 26 value, then, and if. So what I'm saying here is if the value or values, or I should say cells, which are converted to values, that the user selects are equal to what the computer had already generated and the sequence that the computer has stored, then, good. That's great. Proceed with the game. And we also need an else if, or I guess we could just use an else, because if it's not equal to it, then it's game over. So we can say else. So let's go ahead and start writing the code for these. So we know that if the user is correct, the game continues. So we could even just say, game continues. And we can say else game ends. Just if you need confirmation or a reminder which is which. So if the game continues, what is our order of operations? Well, I'd say first and foremost, if the game continues, we want everything to reset. So let's go ahead and just select cell D4 again. Oops, sorry about that. Let's filter through everything. Let's just do cells 4, 4 dot select. So that's first and foremost. Secondly, we'd probably want to say good job, like you actually got it right. So let's just set this value to, good work. How about that? Good work. All right. So we also want to give the user some time, I'd imagine. So after they've made their selection, they get a prompt saying good work. Let's just go ahead and delay, and let's use that waste time function again. Waste time 2 seconds, something like that. And then we'll say cells 5, 8 dot value watch closely. Very similar to how we did it above right here, because we're going to be starting a new turn. So we're just going to be running basically another sequence. We're going to generate a new square, and then we're going to run another sequence. So thankfully, we've already created those sub-procedures, and we're just going to call them now. So new square, and then run sequence. That's also another benefit of, I know I mentioned previously, it's another benefit of having these in separate sub-procedures so that you don't need to copy and paste the code. Because I already have them in separate sub-procedures, I can just reference them right here. So again, the order of operations here, we're going to reset the colors. We're going to tell them they did a good job. We're going to wait 2 seconds just to give them time to reset in their brains. And then we're going to go on to the next turn. So by doing watch closely, we're essentially following the same layout here, except we're not going to use this additional waste time because they're already into the game. They're already paying attention. We don't need to give them any more time. And we also need to make sure that after the sequence has been run, similar to how we did it right here, we need to, first of all, clear out that value that we have in cell. Let's just copy this since we have it right here. We need to clear out that value, and we need to, again, prompt them that it's their turn. So we can just use that code as is, and that's great. But now, let's say they get it wrong. Let's say we're a couple turns in and they get it wrong. We need to basically end the game. So how can we check to see if they got it wrong? Or what can we do? I should rephrase that. We know they've gotten it wrong because the cells do not equal each other. But let's say we want to add in a high score feature, which we know we do because based on what we see here, we want to add in a high score feature. Let's just go ahead and do the score. Let's check the score length 1. Let's just call it that, which is the length of cells 1, 26 dot value. So all I'm doing here is just creating a new variable that says find the length of all the values or all of the numbers, whatever the cell value is. And then we're going to do the same thing for, let's do score length 2, which is length of cells. Actually, instead of doing that, let's use a worksheet function. Let's do application.worksheet function .substitute. Substitute. We'll tap into that. So the reason we want to use this, let me just write it out quickly because I have it in my head. Dot value, comma. It's be easier to explain once I have it out written here. So what we're going to do here is we know this value is the sequence that the computer has generated. So if it's 10 turns in, we'll have 10 numbers and 10 commas. So 1 comma after each number, which means we've gone through the sequence 10 times. What we're doing here is we're going to find the length of cell 126, the same length, except now we're going to substitute each comma with nothing. So again, if we were on, let's say, round 10, there would be 10 numbers generated, which means 10 numbers, 10 commas. So the length, this value would be 20. So that's great. In this case, though, we're going to find the length without the commas, which in our case is, going to be 10 because we know there's 10 commas. So that's going to give us the ability to determine what the final score was based on how many rounds they've made it through. Technically, we could have actually made this simpler now that I'm thinking about it. You could just take whatever score length 1 is and divide it by 2. You could do that. That's actually a lot easier. So instead of using the code that I've written out, you could just do score length 1 divided by 2. Really, it's the same thing. I kind of like the logic behind this, but really this works just as well. It's very simple. You can use that as well. And then to get that final score, we'll call it final score equals score length 1 minus score length 2 minus 1. And the reason we're adding in that minus 1 is because we know that we're just, in this case, let's say if this is 20, this is going to be 10. But since they got that round wrong, they actually didn't complete that round, so we need to subtract 1. So really, it means their high score in this case isn't 10, it's going to be 9 because they only made it to round 9. And here all we're going to do is if final score is greater than, I think it was cells 3, 12 dot value, then we'll just do an end if. And just to confirm, 3, 12 would be 3, 12. That's right, because J is 10, 11, 12. So it's going to check to see the value in there. And if it's greater than that value, then that's awesome. We're going to say cells 5, 8 dot value is equal to, and let's just say something like game over. And then, we will want to tell them they got a new high score. So we'll do and, we'll add a new line. Actually, let's do a line break. VB CRLF is a code that we can use in VBA to basically do a line break. So that's just a line break. And then we're going to say new high score. New high score. Just like that. And then we'll move on and say the new cell, so cells 3, 12 dot value is equal to final score. And that's awesome. But, if the final score of the game isn't a new high score, then we're going to want to do an else. And we're just going to say cells 5, 8 dot value is equal to game over. And in this case, I think that's pretty good. I think, if we have a case if the user beats their high score and if they don't, and either way the game ends because we're not going to call a new, oops. What did I do? Oh, I didn't include a quotation mark. Sorry about that. We know the game ends because we're not going to generate a new square and we're not going to run a new sequence. So let's go ahead and test this. And actually first let's assign that macro. So let's just assign the submit guess. So let's start a new game. It says welcome, waits a few seconds, watch closely. And there we go. So let's select that cell. So if we select that cell and then submit guess, good work, because it matched and it's correct. So now it's saying watch closely and it's selected this cell twice. So I can go ahead and select this cell and then select it again, submit my guess. Good work. That's awesome. So now this time I'm purposely going to get it wrong and we're going to see what happens. So instead of doing yellow, yellow, blue, I'm going to do yellow, blue, yellow. Submit guess. And there we go. Game over, new high score. Your high score is 2. And that's because I made it to the second round successfully, but I made a mistake on the third round. So this is working great. We can go ahead and just run a new game quickly, and you'll see that it restarts. In this case, I'm going to get it wrong to begin with on the first round. So it's blue. I'm just going to guess wrong to begin with, and submit guess. Game over. It's not a new high score, so it's not going to say anything. It's just going to say game over. And that's pretty much it for this section. The last section we're going to focus on is creating an end game sequence, similar to how we created a start game sequence. And that's just a way basically to tell the user the game's over. So we'll move on to that in the next section. So at this point, we have everything running, except now we just want to end a distinct end game sequence, similar to what we had for the start colors sequence. So to do that, let's just go ahead and throw in a new sub procedure, and we'll call this sub end colors. And we know we'll be using this when the game ends. So let's just throw it in where it belongs. There's one spot and there's the second spot. Similar to the start colors procedure, we know we need to toggle off the timing in our waste time. We know we want it to be really quick as it flashes through the cells. So let's just go ahead and use that, and then we'll use it again, set it back to yes. In this case, we know we need to run through another sequence of selecting cells, so let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and actually, we can just copy these. No, we're going to go in a different order. Since we're going to go in a different order, let's just run through that here together. So instead of just selecting the cells as well, let's also add some values. And if you don't know where I'm going with this yet, you'll see where I'm going with it soon. I'm just going to add in a G, an A, an M, and an E. And I'm going to change this to 5. Sorry about that. I'm going to change this to 5. And I'm going to change this to 5, 5. Something like that. So what that's going to do is basically enter in the cells, enter the letters into the cells so that we see game and then over on the screen as we run through each cell being selected. So let's just copy that over, and we'll set this as O, V, E, R. In between all this, we do need to select the cells. So we're going to select cell 3,3.select. Similar to that, we need to select this cell here. So let's select cell 3,5. Let's select cell 5,3, and then 5,5. Okay, perfect. In between this, we do want to waste some time. So I'm just going to go ahead and say waste time 5, just to waste some time. And then we'll go ahead and use these same select statements. Just copy those down. And then lastly, we are going to want to waste a little more time. So let's just go ahead and waste time 5 again. And then we're going to want to clear these cells out. Since, we're entering values in and then we overwrite them, we want to be able to clear them out after all is said and done. So cells 3,3 value is equal to nothing. Cells 3,5 is equal to nothing. 5,3 is equal to nothing, and cells 5,5 is equal to nothing. Sorry, nothing. There we go. So this looks great. I think this will work as expected. Let's go ahead and try it out. So let's go back into our game. We'll start a new game. Welcome. Runs the sequence. Watch closely. So we know it's green. I'm just going to purposely get it wrong so we can run that sequence. Submit yes. Game over, and there you see. Now the letters do show up, but that didn't look very good. So let's go ahead and actually just, to change these cells, actually I need to turn off my worksheet change event. Because what I want to do right now is actually change the formatting in each of these cells, but every time I click a cell, it's going to run that worksheet change event. So let's go back into the code. I'm just going to go ahead here, select everything, and then comment it out. So I've just commented out all of our code in our worksheet change event. So every time now we select the cell here, nothing's going to happen. And that's going to allow me to select all 4 of these cells. I'm going to go in, go back to our stencil, put it in center, and then let's just make the text a little bigger. So when we see a G, we know what it kind of looks like. So let's just make that a little bigger. Something like that. That looks pretty good. So we'll clear that out. We'll go back into our code, and we'll just do Control A, and we'll uncomment all of that code. So that's great. Let's go back to our game, run a new game. Welcome. Watch closely. And again, I'm going to get this wrong on purpose. So your turn. I'm just going to go ahead and do this and submit my guess. And there you go, game over, just like that. So we see how the game works. What we can do now is just go through a test run of everything to make sure everything's working well, and that'll be in the next section. Okay, so at this point we have the game working 100%, and we're just going to do one final run through to make sure there are no other bugs lying around. So before we run the game, let's just change this high score back to 1, and we'll start a new game. And there we see our opening sequence, followed by the welcome statement, and then the watch closely, and then it's going to start the game. So we'll go ahead and select the green, submit our guess. There's our good work. Now we have green followed by orange, our turn. So let's do green, orange, and then submit our guess. And now I'm going to purposely get it wrong just to end the game. So regardless of whatever this is, I'm just going to put in something that's wrong. So I'll do green, yellow, blue. I'll submit the guess, game over, new high score, and there's our sequence that we see. So everything's working great, and that's awesome. So hopefully you enjoyed this video, and hopefully you're able to learn something from it. I will say there are a ton of ways to achieve the same functionality that we just went over, but this is just one way that I found was pretty easy to explain for the most part. Again, in terms of length, it really is only about 150 lines of code in your main procedure, in your main module, followed by your worksheet change, which is only 50 lines of code. So for all intents and purposes, it's really not too code heavy. But it is a great introduction to learning how you can use VBA to, kind of have fun with it. So I think this is a lot of fun. If there are any other recommendations you might have, feel free to leave them in the comments. If there's other games or other applications you think you might want to see, feel free to leave them in the comments, and I'll definitely do my best to get to them. But otherwise, if you like this video, please leave a like, and if this is the content you're kind of interested in, please consider subscribing. So that would really help. Okay, and we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.